detail.
The investigation into Henry Louis Wallace remains one of the most harrowing in North Carolina's history. It exposed not just the cunning of one man, but the blind spots that allowed him to move unseen for so long. Charlotte, a city that had prided itself on progress and safety, was forced to confront the truth that danger had been sitting quietly among them all along. When Henry Louis Wallace was finally taken into custody on March 13, 1994, the city of Charlotte exhaled for the first time in nearly 2 years. The man who had haunted their streets, the smiling face that appeared at so many victims' funerals, was now sitting in an interrogation room under the unforgiving hum of fluorescent light. It was a quiet Sunday, and inside the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, a storm was about to break. Detectives had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment. They had mapped out every connection, every shared workplace, every overlapping thread of friendship between Wallace and his victims. They knew his pattern, his ability to infiltrate trust and turn it into something unspeakable. But what they didn't know was whether he would talk. Wallace was calm when they brought him in, almost eerily so. He didn't fight, didn't protest. He looked like a man resigned to inevitability. As the questioning began, he deflected, his voice low and measured, his eyes shifting between the detectives. He was careful with his words, still trying to maintain control. But the walls were closing in. They laid out the evidence. Witness statements, timelines, phone records, fingerprints, the cruel coincidences that no longer felt coincidental. One by one, the names of the women were read aloud. Caroline Love, Shauna Hawk, Audrey Spain, Valencia Jumper, Michelle Stinson, Betty Jean Baucom, Brandy Henderson. Each name pressed harder against the mask he'd built for years. And then, slowly, something cracked. Wallace exhaled, his shoulders slumping as if a weight he'd carried had finally broken him down.
Please help us make 1,000 subscribers by the year end. Make sure to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and leave comments down below so I can find out what content you'd like to see, and I will reply to everyone. Don't forget to hit the bell to be notified as soon as the next video drops.
What came next was a confession that would shake the room and the nation. Over the next 12 hours, Wallace spoke with chilling composure. His voice never rose, his words never trembled. He confessed to the murders of 9 women in Charlotte, and one more in his hometown of Barnwell, South Carolina. He described how he had known each woman, friends, co-workers, neighbors. He explained in his unnervingly calm way that his actions stemmed from anger, frustration, and what he called a loss of control. But detectives knew it was far more calculated than that. He wasn't describing bursts of rage. He was describing choices. As the hours went on, detectives sat in stunned silence. The picture that emerged was not one of a man consumed by madness, but of a predator who hid behind kindness. Wallace told them how he had attended vigils for his victims, offered condolences to their families, even stood beside police officers during searches for the very women he had already killed. He admitted he had followed the investigation in the news, watching the panic spread while walking freely among those who feared him most. At one point, a detective asked him why. Why these women? Why the deception? Wallace didn't shout or weep. He looked down at his hands, his voice steady, and said that he didn't know why he had done it, that it was like something inside him had taken over. But to those in the room, the answer rang hollow. His tone was too calm, too practiced. It wasn't the voice of a man who had lost control. It was the voice of one who had lived comfortably within the illusion of it. As the confession went on, the detectives alternated between horror and disbelief. Some left the room to compose themselves. Others simply stared, taking notes with shaking hands. Wallace showed flashes of remorse, but they were brief and inconsistent, more like performances than genuine emotion. When asked about the victims' families, he expressed regret, but his words felt detached, as though he were describing someone else's actions. By dawn, the confession was complete. Wallace had admitted to 10 murders, 9 in Charlotte and 1 in South Carolina. The detectives, hollow-eyed and heavy-hearted, had their answers, though none of them felt like justice. They had captured their killer, yes, but they had also stared into the quiet face of something deeply unsettling. As the sun rose over Charlotte that morning, the city began to stir, unaware that its long nightmare had ended just hours earlier. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was still. The detectives knew the case was solved, but the victory felt empty. Too many lives had been lost, too much trust shattered. Henry Louis Wallace was later charged, tried, and convicted of the murders that had terrified a community and broken families. But even after his confession, one truth remained. The monster had never come from the shadows. He had lived among them, laughing, comforting, pretending. And when the mask finally fell, it revealed a man so ordinary that his evil felt all the more terrifying. Henry Louis Wallace was ultimately convicted of murdering 9 women between 1992 and 1994 in Charlotte, North Carolina. These killings formed one of the most chilling and complex serial murder cases in modern American history. Not only for their brutality, but for the horrifying truth that every one of Wallace's victims was someone he personally knew. These 9 confirmed did not include Tashonda, his first, as Wallace confessed to murdering her in Barnwell almost 4 years before the Charlotte murders, and Deborah Slaughter found strangled in her bedroom in March 1994. Henry Louis Wallace's crimes shocked Charlotte, North Carolina, not only because of their brutality, but because of the devastating truth about who his victims were. Unlike many other cases where offenders target strangers, Wallace preyed almost exclusively on women he knew, friends, co-workers, and acquaintances who trusted him. This trust gave him access, and tragically, it became the very weapon he used against them. His victims were young African-American women, many of them hardworking, many of them with dreams still unfolding, all of them part of the same social fabric that Wallace moved through with ease. Some worked alongside him at fast food restaurants, others were girlfriends of his close friends, or women he had known for years in Charlotte's tight-knit communities. He often presented himself as a caring presence, the kind of person who could offer a listening ear or a helping hand. But behind that facade, he harbored darker intentions. Among the women whose lives he cruelly ended were Tashonda Bethea, his first known victim in South Carolina; Caroline Love, a college student and friend of his girlfriend's sister; Sharon Nance, a woman he knew through the community; Audrey Spain, a co-worker at Bojangles; and Deborah Slaughter, who lived in the same apartment complex. Others, like Valencia Jumper, whom he strangled and then set her apartment on fire to disguise his crime, reveal the calculated, yet chaotic nature of his offenses. Each case carried its own chilling detail, yet they all shared the common thread of trust betrayed. The backdrop of his crimes was Charlotte in the early 1990s, a city celebrated for its booming banking industry and modern skyline. Yet beneath that prosperity lay neighborhoods where many young women worked long hours, often in low-paying jobs, carving out a life of independence. Wallace embedded himself in this world, blending in so well that suspicion rarely fell on him, even as women he knew personally began to vanish or turn up dead. What made the case all the more disturbing was how long it took for the pattern to be recognized. For years, Charlotte police did not publicly connect the murders, partly because of assumptions about the victims' backgrounds, and partly because the killer was hiding in plain sight. It was not until 1994, after nearly a dozen women had been taken, that Wallace was finally arrested and the full scale of his crimes was revealed. The legacy of his victims lives on beyond the headlines and the statistics. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and co-workers whose lives mattered deeply to those who loved them. Their stories remind us that behind every crime is a circle of shattered lives, and behind every name is a person who deserved safety and dignity. Henry Louis Wallace's connection to Tashonda Bethea began long before his name became known to the world. Tashonda met Wallace when she was 19. He was familiar, a figure she knew from the same small community, someone who appeared safe. They both grew up in Barnwell, South Carolina, a small rural town where everyone seemed to know one another and where life moved at a slower, more familiar pace. In a town like Barnwell, familiarity often meant trust. It was the kind of place where family ties and community ran deep, where neighbors waved across dirt roads, and where young people crossed paths at school, church, or local hangouts. Wallace and Tashonda came from the same world, tight-knit, humble, and hardworking. He was a few years older, already a familiar face in the neighborhood, and she was known for her charm, her easy smile, and her warmth. Their families lived not far apart, and their circles overlapped in the way that small-town life naturally weaves people together. In Barnwell, everyone was someone's cousin, classmate, or friend. Wallace wasn't a stranger to her. He was part of that extended network of familiarity that defines small-town living. It's likely that they knew each other from school or mutual friends, crossing paths in a community where lives intertwined daily. He may have appeared as nothing more than a local young man, quiet, polite, even helpful. That sense of safety, that illusion of knowing someone because they were from home, was what made the connection so tragically deceptive. Tashonda had no reason to fear him. In her eyes, he wasn't an outsider or a threat. He was someone she recognized, someone she may have spoken to countless times, someone whose presence didn't raise alarm. Their meeting then was not marked by danger, but by normalcy. That was Wallace's disguise from the very beginning. He thrived in spaces where trust existed, where familiarity replaced caution. In a small southern town where people believed they knew one another, that trust became his greatest weapon. At the time of her disappearance and subsequent discovery in the pond, Wallace was known to her. However, he was not charged at the time. In hindsight, the connection between Henry Louis Wallace and Tashonda Bethia stands as the first tragic instance of his pattern, the merging of comfort and danger, trust and betrayal. For Tashonda, it was simply another day in her hometown. For Wallace, it was the start of something far darker, a shadow that would follow him from Barnwell to Charlotte. Caroline Love's life intersected with Henry Louis Wallace's in a way that, at first, seemed ordinary, almost unremarkable, so much so that no one could have imagined the dark path it would lead to. In the early 1990s, Caroline was living in Charlotte, North Carolina, sharing an apartment with her close friend, Sadie McKnight. Caroline was young, ambitious, and hardworking, balancing school and work like so many 20-somethings trying to build a future in a growing city. To help make ends meet, she picked up shifts at the Bojangles restaurant on Central Avenue, a popular fast food spot that doubled as both a workplace and a social hub for many young people in Charlotte at the time. It was through Sadie that Caroline came into contact with Wallace. Sadie was Wallace's girlfriend, and because of this connection, Caroline found herself occasionally around him. At first glance, Wallace didn't stand out as threatening. Quite the opposite. He had a charm about him, an ability to slip into conversations, to make people feel at ease. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was part of the circle of familiarity, the kind of face that blended into everyday life. This was the deceptive mask Wallace wore so well. He lived on the periphery of Caroline's world, close enough to be trusted, far enough not to raise suspicion. For Caroline, he was just her roommate's boyfriend, a man who appeared ordinary in every sense of the word. Yet behind that ordinary facade lay something far more dangerous. That subtle intersection, the roommate connection, the shared workplace, the everyday moments of passing familiarity was how Caroline and Wallace met. And it was that proximity, the kind that feels harmless, that ultimately gave him the access he needed. It was trust, unearned but assumed, that allowed him to step into her world unchecked. Sharon Nance and Henry Louis Wallace moved within overlapping circles in Charlotte during the early 1990s. By this point in his life, Wallace had already built a reputation for being charming and approachable, someone who could blend into nearly any environment without raising alarm. He was known in fast food workplaces, in apartment complexes, and in neighborhoods where people often crossed paths casually. Sharon, meanwhile, was living through her own set of struggles and navigating the difficulties of life in a city that was growing fast but leaving many residents behind. It was during this period that she and Wallace became acquainted. Accounts suggest that Wallace knew Sharon from the community. She wasn't a stranger to him. Their paths intersected in the social spaces of Charlotte, where connections were made quickly and familiarity often passed for trust. This thin thread of connection, ordinary on the surface, was enough for Wallace to gain access to her life. To Sharon, he was simply another familiar face in a city full of acquaintances. She could not have known that behind his easy smile lay something dangerous, nor that this seemingly minor association would one day put her in unimaginable jeopardy. Shauna Hawke's life crossed paths with Henry Louis Wallace in what seemed, at the time, like nothing more than an everyday connection. In the early 1990s, Shauna was working part-time at a Taco Bell in Charlotte while also attending Central Piedmont Community College. Like many young women juggling work and studies, she saw her job as a way to earn money, gain experience, and stay connected with her community. Wallace, too, was part of that same Taco Bell environment. He had a way of blending into workplaces, presenting himself as friendly and easygoing, the sort of person who quickly gained trust. In Shauna's world, he wasn't a shadow lurking on the margins. He was a familiar face, part of the ordinary rhythm of her job. Their association grew simply out of proximity. Shauna, with her natural kindness and willingness to help others, would not have seen any danger in knowing him. He wasn't an outsider. He was someone she and her co-workers recognized, a man who seemed safe within the walls of her daily routine. It was this sense of familiarity that became so deceptive. For Shauna, meeting Wallace was not a moment of significance. It was simply part of her everyday world, as harmless as any acquaintance made through work. Yet in hindsight, it was this thread of connection, seemingly innocent, that placed her within reach of a danger no one could have foreseen. Audrey Spain's path crossed with Henry Louis Wallace in the most ordinary of ways, the kind of everyday connection that felt safe and unremarkable at the time. In the early 1990s, Audrey was working shifts at a Taco Bell in Charlotte to help support herself while building her independence. It was a common job for many young adults in the city. Fast food restaurants were places of steady work, camaraderie, and a kind of surrogate family where co-workers often spent long hours side by side. Wallace, too, was part of that world. He had a pattern of inserting himself into the rhythms of these workplaces, blending in with his charm and easy manner. To Audrey and her colleagues, he was just another face in the mix, someone they interacted with as part of the daily hum of the job. Nothing about him stood out as threatening. In fact, his demeanor often leaned toward helpful and friendly, a mask he wore convincingly. For Audrey, their meeting wasn't dramatic, nor was it significant in the moment. It was the kind of acquaintance that happens naturally in a work environment. Someone you see on shift, someone you may chat with casually, someone you simply come to recognize in the small orbit of daily life. She had no reason to suspect anything sinister, no reason to keep her distance. This was Wallace's insidious skill. He didn't arrive in people's lives as a stranger from the dark. He slipped in quietly, under the guise of familiarity, until the trust was already there. For Audrey, that trust was simply an extension of everyday normalcy. She met him in the place where she worked hard and built friendships, never knowing that what seemed harmless would one day prove fatal. Valencia Jumper met Henry Louis Wallace through the warm, familiar web of friendship and everyday trust that connected so many young people in Charlotte during the early 1990s. She wasn't a stranger to him. In fact, she was a close friend of Wallace's sister. That single thread of connection, a family friendship, was what first brought them into each other's lives. At the time, Valencia was studying at Johnson C. Smith University and living in her own apartment. She was independent, focused, and full of optimism. Through his sister, Wallace had become a familiar figure in her orbit, someone she recognized, someone she likely felt comfortable around. There was nothing in his demeanor to spark suspicion. To those who knew him casually, Wallace came across as friendly, soft-spoken, and disarming. Their interactions were likely polite and ordinary, the kind that pass unnoticed in daily life. He wasn't a stranger from the shadows. He was a familiar face tied to someone she trusted. That made all the difference. It meant that when he appeared at her door, there was no reason for her to be afraid. No reason to second-guess what seemed like a normal visit. For Valencia, this was simply a connection born of friendship. Her friend's brother, someone she had no cause to fear. But for Wallace, it was something else entirely. He used familiarity as his mask, comfort as his cover. That quiet, unassuming link, formed through family ties and the innocence of trust, would become one of the cruelest parts of her story. For Valencia, what began as a simple acquaintance was never meant to hold danger. Yet in that ordinary bond lay the thread that would later lead to unthinkable tragedy. Michelle Stinson's connection to Henry Louis Wallace began the way so many of his encounters did, quietly, naturally, and without any trace of alarm. In the early 1990s, Michelle was living in Charlotte, raising her 2 young sons and working hard to build a better future for them. She was part of a close-knit community, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and acquaintances who looked out for one another. Among those familiar faces was Wallace, a man who had become something of a regular presence in her social circle. They weren't strangers. Wallace had known Michelle through mutual friends, the kind of casual community links that often form in apartment complexes and shared neighborhoods. He was the type of man who made a point of appearing trustworthy, friendly, polite, even charming. To someone like Michelle, a devoted mother who saw good in people, he didn't stand out as dangerous. He was just another acquaintance, another face from the local scene, someone she might greet in passing without hesitation. Their conversations were likely light, familiar exchanges. Short chats, neighborly pleasantries, the kind of small talk that gives no reason for fear. Wallace had a way of slipping into people's lives through the softest of openings, using comfort and familiarity as his disguise. For Michelle, there was no warning, no reason to doubt his intentions. Her world revolved around her children, her work, her home. Safety for her was something she built through faith, effort, and love. That was the cruel deception of it all. Wallace didn't appear as a threat. He appeared as someone she could trust. It was that ordinary sense of comfort, the assumption of safety in the familiar, that allowed him access. For Michelle, that trust was natural, even kind. For Wallace, it was calculated. Deborah Ann Slaughter first met Henry Louis Wallace in the most ordinary way imaginable, through her social circle in Charlotte. By 1994, Wallace had woven himself into the lives of several women in the community, always presenting as kind, soft-spoken, and trustworthy. Deborah, a young mother working hard to raise her daughter, had no reason to see him as anything other than a familiar face. Their connection came through mutual friends. Wallace was known in the same circles, moving easily among them, always blending in. He had mastered the art of seeming harmless, helpful when needed, always ready with a smile or a word of encouragement. To those who met him, he appeared considerate, the type of man who could be relied upon. To Deborah, he was likely just another acquaintance in her orbit, perhaps someone she'd seen or spoken with a few times, without the slightest hint of danger. It was this familiarity that made his presence so unassuming. Wallace's manner carried none of the menace that would have warned others to stay away. His charm, subtle but convincing, was his disguise. He didn't need to force his way into people's lives. They opened the door willingly, unaware of what hid beneath the surface. For Deborah, meeting him would have felt unremarkable, a passing introduction, a casual friendship through trusted connections. Yet that ordinary thread of acquaintance, woven through community and familiarity, would become the unseen bridge between her daily life and the horror that would later unfold. Vanessa Mack met Henry Louis Wallace through the quiet, familiar rhythms of everyday life in Charlotte. By early 1994, both of them lived in the same apartment complex, a place where residents often crossed paths in hallways, parking lots, and laundry rooms. It was the kind of community where neighbors smiled in passing, exchanged small talk, and trusted the faces they saw often. Wallace was one of those faces. He had a way of making himself seem ordinary, even friendly. He presented himself as approachable, a man who could strike up conversation about anything, from work to the weather. For Vanessa, a kind and open-hearted woman, there was no reason to see danger in him. He lived nearby, appeared polite, and, like so many others, was part of the background of her daily routine. Their connection grew naturally out of that shared environment. He wasn't a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. He was a familiar neighbor, someone she might have greeted on her way to work or spoken to in the parking lot. That thin thread of acquaintance built on casual familiarity became the bridge through which he would later gain her trust. Vanessa, ever warm and courteous, likely saw him as nothing more than another person in her orbit, a neighbor, a casual acquaintance, a harmless presence. But Wallace used precisely that illusion of normalcy to move unnoticed. His calm demeanor disarmed suspicion. His politeness concealed what lay beneath. In hindsight, the tragedy of it all is that there was nothing unusual about how they met. There was no warning, no moment that hinted at the danger ahead. Just two people who lived in the same place, one good-hearted and genuine, the other hiding behind the mask of familiarity. Betty Jean Bauckham met Henry Louis Wallace in a setting that, to anyone else, would have seemed completely safe. Through work, the familiar heartbeat of everyday life. At the time, Betty was the assistant manager at a Bojangles restaurant in Charlotte, a place where Wallace also worked. It was a busy, friendly environment where co-workers joked, shared stories, and built the kind of casual connections that come naturally when people spend long hours side by side. Betty, known for her warmth and professionalism, took her job seriously but treated her team like family. She was dependable, fair, and genuinely cared about the people around her. To her, Wallace was just another employee, a friendly, polite man who seemed eager to help. He wasn't someone who drew suspicion or caused trouble. On the surface, he blended in easily, performing his duties, earning trust through his calm and cooperative nature. Their relationship was rooted in that workplace familiarity. Wallace's ability to appear harmless, even likable, meant that people lowered their guard around him. Betty had no reason to see him as anything but a colleague. He smiled easily, spoke softly, and showed none of the aggression that defined the person he truly was beneath the mask. In a world where trust is built on routine and reliability, Wallace exploited both. Betty's trusting nature, her belief in treating people with respect, became the doorway he used to get close. She saw him as part of her team, a worker under her supervision, not as someone capable of cruelty. And that was the tragedy of it. In the end, their connection was born of something as ordinary as shared shifts and small talk in the workplace. It was the same deceptive ordinariness that had marked so many of Wallace's connections. Familiarity masking danger, trust paving the way for betrayal. Randy June Henderson met Henry Louis Wallace through the most ordinary and unthreatening of paths, through friendship and familiarity. In the early 1990s, Brandy was living in Charlotte with her infant son, carving out a young mother's life filled with hope and quiet determination. She was friends with several people in the same neighborhood, part of a small, close-knit circle that shared laughs, stories, and support. It was through that circle that Wallace appeared. A familiar face, someone known and trusted by the people around her. He wasn't a stranger. In fact, Wallace's girlfriend at the time was one of Brandy's closest friends, and because of that connection, he became part of Brandy's social world. He was the kind of man who made himself seem harmless, easygoing, kind, always quick with a smile or a friendly word. To Brandy, he was simply her friend's boyfriend, someone who occasionally visited, someone who was part of the background of her everyday life. That's what made his presence so deceptive. Wallace had perfected the art of appearing ordinary, blending into people's lives until their guard naturally fell. For Brandy, a trusting and open-hearted young woman, there was no reason to be wary of him. He was connected to someone she cared about, part of a circle that felt safe and familiar. In hindsight, this connection, so casual, so innocent, became the thread that led to tragedy. What Brandy saw as trust and friendship was, in truth, Wallace's camouflage. He used kindness as his mask, normalcy as his shield, and the illusion of familiarity to slip quietly past suspicion. To Brandy, he was simply someone she knew through a friend. To Wallace, she was another soul drawn into his reach through the comfort of trust. It was that false sense of safety, born from friendship, that made his betrayal all the more monstrous.
Please help us make 1,000 subscribers by the year end. Make sure to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and leave comments down below so I can find out what content you'd like to see, and I will reply to everyone. Don't forget to hit the bell to be notified as soon as the next video drops.
Following his capture, the courtroom battles that would follow would be as chilling as the crimes themselves. After being convicted in 1997 of 9 murders, alongside charges of rape, robbery, and assault, Henry Louis Wallace, the man later known as the Charlotte Strangler, faced not just the judgment of a jury, but the scrutiny of every legal safeguard America affords. He was sentenced to death for each of those murders, yet the question that lingered long after the trial was whether justice had been served fairly, or whether the glare of media headlines and the methods of police interrogation had crossed the line. The years between his conviction and the appeal heard in 2009 were marked by filings and motions. Wallace's defense argued that his trial in Charlotte had been poisoned by relentless publicity. Newspaper articles, television broadcasts, even police press conferences had painted him as a monster before his trial began. Could a jury drawn from that same community ever truly be impartial? Wallace's lawyers thought not. They pressed the courts to consider that the overwhelming coverage had deprived him of the very thing the Constitution promises: a fair trial. But the appellate judges weighed the record and saw it differently. They noted that while media attention was indeed widespread, most of it was factual reporting, not the kind of sensational material that turns courtrooms into hollow rituals. By the time Wallace's trial began nearly 2 years after his arrest, much of the intensity had faded. Jurors admitted they had heard of the case, but they swore under oath that they could set aside what they'd read and judge solely on the evidence presented. In the court's eyes, this met the standard of fairness, however imperfect. Then came the second claim: the confessions themselves. Wallace had told investigators in harrowing detail how he killed, naming names, describing scenes, and leading police to the remains of his victims. But his lawyers argued these confessions should never have been heard in court. They said the police had deliberately delayed reading him his rights to manipulate his willingness to speak. They even pointed to a moment when an investigator held Wallace's hand in prayer, urging him to find peace by unburdening his soul. Was this spiritual appeal a way of breaking his will? The court listened carefully, yet their conclusion was decisive. Wallace had been given his Miranda rights. He had signed the form acknowledging them, and he had continued to talk, calmly, knowingly, repeatedly. The prayer, the judges said, was not coercion by law, but rather a moral nudge. His words were his own, and they would stand. And so, in December 2009, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the death sentences. Henry Louis Wallace would remain on death row, his attempts at overturning the outcome extinguished. The lesson is sobering. Justice is not just about what is decided in the courtroom, but about how those decisions are reached. Wallace's case reveals the delicate balance between protecting the rights of the accused and seeking justice for the victims. It shows us how courts wrestle with questions of fairness, of truth, and of the methods used to secure it. And perhaps the deepest takeaway is this: in the pursuit of justice, truth must not only be found, it must be found rightly, lest the very system meant to protect us all be undermined.